Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
Change is in the air. Can you feel it? Whether it's from a mild winter, I've been told it's a mild winter. It's the only Dallas winter I've ever known, so it's into springtime or other transitions we might be experiencing. I think each of our readings addresses an aspect of change. In Joshua, we read as the Israelites end their time wandering in the desert, no longer reliant on the manna that God provides, but actually cultivating crops. In Corinthians, we read as Paul forms a Christology that recognizes not just Jesus' humanity, but his divinity and the reconciliation that can be found therein. And the change that we find in this parable is rather significant as well. Now, before I delve too much further into the readings, I'll say I remember a period where I was going to experience significant change as I prepared to move from preschool into elementary school. And my sisters were aiming to help prepare me for this transition, and they would always tell me about the teachers that taught the grade level I was going into, having been through the same schools, and help prepare me for what I might expect. They were really into this school thing, and despite their enthusiasm, it never really took with me, but they still tried. But they also were trying to prepare my heart and my mind for the pep talks that my dad used to love to deliver as he drove the kids to school each morning. And they were quick to recapitulate the main points of each. They said, on Monday morning you'll always hear, other people are still thinking about what happened over the weekend. But not the Klitzkes. No, they're ready to focus at the task at hand and enter a new week refreshed from the weekend. And they're ready to be engaged. And then, Tuesday had its own spiel, and Wednesday, of course, was the middle of the week. Well, Thursday, everybody was already thinking about Friday. But not the Klitzkes. And Friday, of course, everybody was already focused on the weekend for sure. But not the Klitzkes. And so they prepared me for this, although I think they may have over-prepared me. Either that or my dad had a little less pep in his pep talks by the time the fourth child came along. Maybe that's the case. I'm not sure. They also claimed, and I never experienced this, although I will say elementary school started earlier, and then he would drop off older sisters at other schools. So maybe I just didn't have the benefit of experiencing this. But they claimed that he had a tape that he used to love to play as they arrived at school with the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And while my father was not one to usually sing in church, they claimed that he would belt out, he would try to time it, so when they pulled up to school, as the doors opened, he'd be singing, "Glory, glory, hallelujah," because he couldn't really think of any better way to make his children run to school. And then he'd turn to anybody who would listen and say, "Look, the Klitzkes run to school. They don't walk like all of the other children, they run. Look at them run." Yeah, they're running from you, Dad. But sometimes the story of the lore is better than the actual events. Perhaps that's the case here. I do think this parable we have in Luke has great tradition around it, and perhaps it's one, perhaps you've heard it before. I think it's all too often mislabeled or probably an inappropriate emphasis as we call it the Prodigal Son. And indeed, the first part of this story really does focus on the younger son, but I think that's it's not helpful because both sons and the father have really significant aspects in this story and none of those can be, they shouldn't be undermined by labeling this particular parable with one character in mind. And even, I think, it's important to note how this parable is ensconced among other parables in this Gospel of Luke. I'll also say, just for your reference, this is actually the only time it comes up in the lectionary because this parable is only found in Luke. So just make yourselves comfortable because there's lots to say, and it only comes up once every 3 years, so I have to say it all right now. Indeed, I think the context is really helpful and important. We have Jesus gathered with tax collectors and sinners. And just the fact that he would gather with them was disheartening to some of the religious scholars of the time and those who were faithful in their attendance at temple. The fact that he would break bread with them, commune with them, commit to some aspect of hospitality and formative time with them was problematic for the Pharisees and scribes. And so the Pharisees and scribes are grumbling to him, to Jesus. And it's this parable that he uses to respond to them, perhaps better called the parable of the two sons. Now, certainly, we can attribute a great deal to this parable, even in our modern understanding. Notions of eldest and youngest are certainly a part of a family dynamic that remains important, and certainly there are characteristics that sometimes attributed to those the birth order that are kind of, they're stereotypes, but for a reason, right? There's some universal truth to them, even if they're not true in every instance. And so that's been true for humanity for a very, very long time. But I think some context of the particulars in this age are also helpful. Now, we have the youngest son who approaches the father and asks for his inheritance. Now, I think it's fair to say this would be tremendously insulting in any generation, in any age. I think it may be particularly problematic in the age in which this parable is told. In part, what he's asking, it's really insulting to the father, right? It's this notion as if to say, the relationship with you is only as good as the wealth that it might provide, or the status that it might provide. I have no care for you. Almost as if he's saying, I wish you were dead. I wish you were dead so I could just have what's mine. And so it's well within the father's right to just take his son to school on this, right? He should be singing him the Battle Hymn of the Republic, probably. But there would be no judgment from anybody in that household or otherwise if the father just let loose a verbal assault or even a physical reprimand in this case for the audacious insult that this younger son offers as he comes and asks for the inheritance. But instead, we find a father who's willing to give it. And the gospel probably understates how big of a thing this really is. The gospel just says, and so he divided his wealth. He divided his lands. As a matter of fact, like it was as simple as going to the bank and transferring funds. But the reality is, in order for him to provide the inheritance, he would have had to sell lands. He would have had to sell livestock. He would have had to sell things that were not only helpful to him or meaningful to him or sentimental to him, but what's more, those things had societal consequences as well. The reality is he would have certain status based on how much land, and the fact that he was relinquishing land would have been detrimental to his status among his peers and within the community and the society that was around them. The fact that he would do this would have been a major clue to folks about what kind of person this father really was, because it would have set him far apart from anybody else, and certainly far apart from any societal norm or expectation of the father figure. And then the son proceeds to leave to a distant country and squander everything he's been entrusted with. And it's not lost on those gathered, particularly the Pharisees and the scribes, the fact that this son is left feeding pigs. A disgusting job of a dirty animal, and particularly in the Jewish culture, this would have been the worst job you could have imagined for him. And not only that, he's coveting their food. And so it's no wonder that it comes to mind that he might return home with the hope of not restoring his relationship with his dad, but just the fact that his father might allow him to work for him. Now, I've had some long trips in my life, and I've had even not that long of a distance trip, but the psychological nature of a trip is sometimes more bearing than the actual distance traveled. Whether you have to go somewhere to deal with something, or you have to go to respond to something, or you have to go and you know that it's not going to be a good conversation when you get there. And I suspect that you can relate to this kind of expectation where it's almost with a certain, while you know it's the best thing and that it's your best hope that you have to go, there's certain hesitancy that makes you kind of drag your feet if you're walking and just walk a little slower as you get closer and closer to your destination. Perhaps you find yourself easing off the gas pedal as you get closer to the last few turns, and you're probably in your mind second-guessing yourself just a little bit, maybe rehearsing the speech or the expectation of the conversation that will happen once you arrive. And I like to think that that's probably what that younger son is doing. He's probably he's probably dragging his feet as he gets closer. He's probably nervous. He could probably feel his stomach rising up towards his throat and not quite sure how this whole thing is going to go when the father spots him. Now, don't miss this. A man in the father's position wouldn't run for pretty much anything. And yet, he does to his son. Part of the reason he wouldn't run is because it wasn't dignified to run. Part of the reason he wouldn't run is because in order to run, he would have had to gather up his garments in order for them not to get tangled and reveal his legs as he runs out to the street to embrace his son, who's probably still practicing that speech in his head, to try to ask for forgiveness, not to restore a relationship immediately. He had no expectation of that, but instead he finds a father with a warm embrace, one who's calling upon others to bring out a robe to clothe him, bringing out sandals that his feet might find comfort, and a ring for his finger, not just as a sign of wealth, but probably a signet ring that would represent him as a restored member of the family, at least in some small sense, that he could at least perform commerce as he went into the community on behalf of his family with such a ring as he's given in this radical welcome home. What grace, what powerful imagery of mercy and love and compassion we have in this story. This is the Father welcoming his Son. But let's not miss what happens, because even the son who stayed, the son who's been faithful, the gospel says that he's coming back from the fields, and he's not even sure what's going on. He can't quite imagine, can't quite fathom, because it's probably a party unlike that household has seen or experienced perhaps ever before. I mean, it is a glorious thing happening, and he says to somebody, "What's going on?" And he says, "Well, your brother, your dad's son, came home." And he's angry. Now, I suspect whether you're an eldest or not, you could probably relate to the anger that rises up within the older son in this story, because at times the injustice of the grace and mercy that someone else experiences just doesn't seem to merit the actions or the lives they've lived. And so it's not without some amount of empathy that we can examine the response from this older son as he refuses to go into the party, the celebration that his father is hosting and has welcomed everybody into to celebrate the return of his son. Instead, he's forced his father to come out to him to find out what is going on. And we have an older son who says, I've never left. I've been a slave for you. Hear the resentment oozing out as he tries to help his father understand the emotions that are welling up within him. I've been a slave for you. I've done everything you've asked. And you haven't even rewarded me with a young goat to celebrate with my friends. I wonder if he ever asked. But I also think so often at this point in the parable, we want and yearn to know what happens the next day, right? We want to know what happens the next week, or in a month, or in 3 months, or 6 months. But I have to say, the beauty and majesty of all of the parables is that we are left to our imaginations to cultivate those stories. And I think there's a certain amount of beauty in that, but I do think it bears noting that the context is important. And as we look at the whole of the Gospel of Luke, what we'd find, as we look, there's a whole sequence of parables, but the two that precede the parable of the two sons are a parable of a lost sheep first. And guess what? They go look for the sheep, right? And a parable of a lost coin. Nobody rests until the coin is found. And here, the contrast must have struck those gathered as Jesus instructed them. That while the brother, the eldest son, may have done everything the Father had asked of him, there are times and occasions where those things that have not been asked or requested still ought to be done. And if we look at this story, we know that when a son that runs away with his inheritance, that somebody ought to chase after him. Somebody ought to pursue him. Somebody ought to be asking for a restoration of relationship with the hope that maybe something is possible. And yet, it doesn't say that. He was never asked. But it doesn't take too much imagination to know if someone was supposed to pursue that younger son, it should have been the older brother. And if the Father in this parable is God the Father Almighty who extends grace, mercy, compassion in great abundance to us, then He has sent us the greatest older brother we might imagine, His only Son. Not just from village to village, not just to a distant country, but from heaven to earth, that He might extend the grace, mercy, and compassion of God to us. Without merit, without expectation. And I think so often we might relate to one brother or another, but the reality is in the course of our lives we might relate to both brothers. We might even have some understanding or sympathy for the father in this story, but I hope that we might consider how we are an elder brother to others. The elder brother in this story is spending an inheritance that isn't even his yet. And I think sometimes as a church, as an institution, Christians sometimes do the same thing. We cast grand statements or expectations about who will get into heaven or be granted eternal life, when in fact those are not ours to give or to take away. They belong to God. And the hope and expectation for us is that we might be a good older brother and continue to pursue those who are lost, that they might be found, that we might continue to pursue those who have yet to understand the grace, compassion, and mercy that we find in God and extend it to them, that they might be received into the household of God with an abundant celebration, that they might be clothed with great robes, sandals placed on their feet, rings placed on their fingers, that we, the people of God, are expected to pursue that for all who are lost. Let us not be afraid of looking foolish. Let us embrace the image of the Father, gathering up His robes and running out to find those who need this message of love and forgiveness. And let this season of Lent be a time where we are intentional about it.